Hello and welcome to the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything fantasy and science fiction. Your host is Matt Crosswhite, and the subject matter expert is Josiah Marshall. And here we go. Welcome to our first full-length episode of Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. I'm your host, Matt, and I'm joined by subject matter expert Josiah Marshall. And Josiah, you've got two books in front of you today. You've got are they comic book versions of Pilgrim's Progress and In the Beginning?
Yep.
Tell us about these.
I figured I'd kick this off with going back to some of the more basics of what would be considered fantasy by some or science fiction by others. But really what I wanted to do was be able to go back to what we considered the first real storytelling book, and that was the Bible. And what a fun way to do it too, right? Because when you get to do things that involve pictures and pictures about familiar stories and have ways of seeing those stories in another way. Look, there it is. There's the pillar of cloud guiding them through the wilderness, the Israelites. And so these are ways that people, and I'm not just talking about kids, but adults as well, can engage with a story. Because when you're going to think about story, you're going to be thinking in several ways. And one of them is going to be through some visual representation, whether that's in here in your imagination or if it's on the page. Right. And so
absolutely,
comic books have actually been used for quite a while now. What some people don't know is that Marvel comic books actually printed some Christian comic book series. They even did the Screw Tape letters. We'll get into that one another episode, but they did Screw Tape letters. They did In His Steps by Sheldon and several others. And so comic books have been seen as a great way to really introduce story, because not only just going to talk about fantasy and science fiction, but we're also going to talk about story in these episodes as well. Because if there's one thing that story is able to do, it tends to validate an individual and enable them to have a voice to give a reflection on something that they've seen or heard. And if there's one story that definitely people have seen and heard and reflected on, it is the Bible. But this was written by Chariot Books. Chariot Books Publishing was a subsidiary of David C. Cook Publishing. Now, David's a little interesting tidbit about them. They started back in 1875, and they were a printing house putting out material for Christian churches and people and organizations after the big fire of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did a lot of work in being able to revitalize people, especially when it came to even comics of even that age. There's comics that go back decades. It's really quite wild. But one of the things that they did is that they did a series of these. This is volume 1 of four volumes, I believe. And so it is a great way to be able to capture kids' imagination, because if there was one thing I would constantly be asked when I owned my bookstore, even when I worked as a librarian, is I really want to get my kid either into reading or into the Bible. And so what better and fun way to do that than with the Bible in such a fun form? And you've got these vivid colors. Now, these are not the only ones out there. Okay.
Sure.
There is other publishing houses such as Kingstone who've been doing very similar comic books. You've also got others that are even doing what's called the Action Bible, which is
I've seen that one.
Have you seen that? Yeah. Oh man, it's so cool. It's the entire Bible, not word for word, mind you, but it is the entire Bible in comic book form. Wow. It is fascinating because you can get into Ezekiel and Isaiah. You can get into Revelation and see all of these visual depictions of what's being described, and it can be eye-popping. It can be very eye-popping. But one of the ways that I've always tried to educate people about when it comes to story or even what would be deemed as fantasy or Christian fantasy, or so, as some people call it, speculative fiction, is the history of it, the great heritage we have, especially within the Christian genre of fantasy. Even though many people have mixed ideas, a lot of it was aimed at C.S. Lewis when they said to him that magic should not be paired with the gospel. And so as a result, the Chronicles of Narnia and some of his other stuff were bashed. They weren't well received. They were not well received.
That just blows my mind that
yeah,
someone that when it was first, because I didn't necessarily grow up in a Christian household or anything, but everybody in Christianity now reveres C.S. Lewis, and almost everybody is at least somewhat familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, whether because of the movies that came out or they read the series or they read the series to their kids. It just blows my mind that they weren't well received when he first published them.
No, they were not. They were not. And we'll be talking about this author in other episodes, but George MacDonald was he's considered the great grandpappy of fantasy, and not just Christian fantasy, but fantasy in general. I've actually met many. Oh yeah, I've actually met many authors who said that they will read George MacDonald for a lot of ideas. And he was a pastor. He was, I believe, a Presbyterian pastor in Scotland, and he was a better story writer and teller than he was a preacher. it was kind of funny about that, but then it goes to the reception. People weren't really eager to hear what they would call folklore. That wasn't fantasy. We didn't have the idea of what we have as today as fantasy. Back in those days, you were talking about folklore, and in some cases, you were talking about dreams, which is why I'm bringing this one up also today. This is the Pilgrim's Progress. This one was published by Kingstone Comics as a 2-book series. Okay. Ooh. You can get, again, with the other one, a visualization of things, of the story as he goes along on his journey. With some of those already familiar with Pilgrim's Progress, you'll understand when I say that when you get to see places such as this one right here, where he's got to walk between the chained animals and not freak them out. Yeah, the 2
great lions. Yeah.
There's
and he's told as long as he stays on the sliver of light, the line between them, they can't get to him.
Yep, exactly. And so even in the front of this book, which I kind of like a lot, it has a character chart. So you can see who's who.
How fun is that?
So you got Christian, evangelist, there's Pliable, there's the Pope. This is not the Pope that we're thinking of today, folks. So don't worry about that.
Yes.
Very different. So Faithful gets introduced into the 2nd volume of this series, along with Money, Love, and Save All, and Guilt, and so on. But you've also got Obstinate, one of the more popularly known characters, Worldly Wise Man, and so on. And so when you're wanting to get into fantasy, Christian fantasy, now I would put this book in that section only because it has elements here that you would find in a fantasy story. And we'll talk more about what it means to call something a fantasy in later episodes. But I wanted to start off with this one because this one it's being forgotten, sadly. Yeah. John Bunyan, a little bit about the author. While in jail, he started having these dreams, and he started writing them down. And there's even some stories where they would smuggle this story out of the jail, or else they would. This is just one story. There's several, but this is one story where they had to smuggle the story out of the jail to get it in the hands of people and to save it. But now it's one of the most popular, most known about stories in the Christian world today, and it's still referenced. And so if you want more than just a simple comic book, which this isn't just a simple comic book, it still gets you thinking, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
There are plenty of ways to see it and enjoy the story. which I'll outline a couple of those real quick. One of them is an old live action film from the 1970s that starred Liam Neeson. Liam Neeson, of all people, the guy that you think of today as that taken dialogue or monologue, he played in the show, and he played Evangelist. Of all characters, he played Evangelist. He was always coming to Pilgrim's rescue. So when Pilgrim fell into the
Slough of Despond.
Yes, he went and helped him out, get out of it. And so that was a very fun one. You can still find that today, mostly on YouTube. You can just type it into YouTube. You can find it there. Others have been some radio readings that have been done over the years. Most of those have been lost. CBS, I know, did one a long time ago. I have not been able to find it, but who knows? It could be on YouTube now, and I just don't know. But BBC even did some takes on it as well. But when you get more modern days, you start seeing more different medias being used, especially since you got the popularity of it. But one of the key, really neat things about this book is that since it parallels the Christian story and the progress of a Christian so well, there are annotated editions where you open it up and next to a paragraph could be a Bible verse. Or what they're talking right there could be connected to a Bible verse. And then of course they're written for adults, they're written for kids. And it's even been written in Braille. That's just how much this book has been around, and it's been translated into so many languages. But even recently, you've got these cartoon movies. You have another one from the 1970s. You got the most recent one, which was recently came out, which is very good. And so if you want to get into some Christian heritage and know something about it and then be able to enjoy it, this is what you want to start with. Okay.
So let me ask you a question about Pilgrim's Progress.
Sure.
I know that that's the first of the first one that was released, and as far as I'm aware, that's the most popular one. But then there was a second one about his wife and kids, of Christian's wife and kids.
Was
there a third?
I was just going to ask,
are there more than just the two?
Yep. There's more than just the two. Even C.S. Lewis wrote another book. Pilgrim's Regress. Yeah, Pilgrim's Regress.
Oh, I have heard of that. I haven't read it though.
Lewis wrote that one. Yeah. And so, and then there have been many people who have had different takes, and so there have been all sorts of commentaries, retellings of the story. Adventures in Odyssey did do a podcast. Episodes of Pilgrim's Progress. And,
gotcha. But there are 3 original ones by John Bunyan.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Very cool.
And that was from, they were originally published in 1678. So that gives you a bit of an age of these stories and how well they've continued to hold up. Right.
Yes.
But yeah, he was technically arrested on the charge of preaching outside of the Church of England. You're only supposed to preach in the church. He preached outside of it. And so that's why he actually got arrested. But there was the charge of him trying to help the lay people learn to read either Latin or try to translate it so they could read it. So that's just some basic history behind him on that. But it is one of the most regarded and significant works of religious English literature of all time. And it has, it's more than 200 languages. More than 200 languages it's been translated into.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of ways to be able to experience story. And that's one of the things I like getting people into. If you can't read it, then look at it. If you can't look at it and you want to listen to it, then listen to it. There's ways to listen to it. There's even 2 different companies that have put out a radio dramatization of this, audio dramas. And then if you don't want to listen to it, you want to watch it, there's movies. And there's plenty of that around.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. I feel like this has been a good a good introduction to our podcast and where we'd like to take it, but also some really good information on a couple of specific books. So thank you very, very much for that. Excellent. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. Until we get together again, happy listening, happy reading. Until next time, take care.